let these folks come in. There's people coming in. Takes a minute. Hello, Shannon.
Hi there.
Award-winning artist.
Great
One of these
to
days
see
I'm gonna. Okay, Barbara, you've got the participant area so you can let more people in as they join.
Yes, I will.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
All right. Well, good afternoon. Early afternoon, late afternoon, maybe still morning, depending on where you are. Thanks for joining us today. We are the Hardy Group, and this is one of our fireside chats that we'll be having. The title today is The Federal Shakeup, What's Changing in Higher Ed. I think you could also call it what's blowing up, what's not changing, what's put anything on there that you like. But we're really excited to have Chris with us today. And let me go to the next slide. So let me just tell you just a minute about the Hardy Group, if you're not familiar with us. We are a boutique strategic consulting group. We deal with online learning and strategic planning around online learning. We also work with institutions around data literacy, data fluency, becoming a data improvement center. We also work with schools on AI frameworks and policy. And we do workshops around things like empathetic communication, how to really talk to students in a way that does not put more fear in them when they're taking exams and have other activities going on. I'm the founder and the chief strategist. Today I'm joined with Rob Robinson, who is a senior strategist and our chief operating officer at the Hardy Group. And he and I will be moderating this panel with Chris Murray. If you don't know Chris, you're lost. You need to know Chris. Chris is somebody everyone in higher education needs to know well. He is a partner at Thompson Coburn in DC. He came to school in DC, I won't say many years ago, but some time ago, and never left, and has sort of lived in the intersection of technology, ed tech, higher ed, politics, policy, all together. So he usually, almost always, has his thumb right on what's happening and is great at reporting it back to those of us so we can understand what's going on. Just an aside, Chris is always very busy and he's meeting with people all the time. I've asked him before what he does in his spare time. I know he goes to Colorado. He and his husband, Andres, go to Colorado every summer and you work from there? How long?
Yeah, for about 8 weeks.
For about 8 weeks. They go to the Telluride Film Festival and other festivals and things in the area with their dogs. So he gets a break from the heat of where he is in DC when he goes out to Colorado. So he does find time to play sometimes. So with that, I want to go ahead and get us started. And I think, Chris, why don't we start with you just telling everyone just briefly about you, like what's your day to day?
Sure. It is great to see some friends on here, and it is even better to be with my very good friends, Rob and Darcy. So thanks for inviting me to participate in this. So my day to day, I'm going to kind of zoom out a little bit and talk about my firm's higher ed practice. So I like to say that we've got a four-legged stool. I look after our lobbying and policy presence. So that's really Capitol Hill and senior levels of the administration. And then we've got three other very important legs to the stool. Number two is the regulatory side, and that's led by my colleague, Erin Lacey, that I expect a lot of you know. The third leg of the stool is corporate M&A. That's our colleague, Emily Wang Murphy. She's really the nation's leading expert in nonprofit and public institution M&A. So think a large public institution wants to acquire, say, a small faith-based institution and essentially acquire the campus for real estate purposes. That's what Emily does on a daily basis, in addition to a lot of other corporate law. And then finally, my colleague Trey Cleveland out of our Birmingham office looks after litigation. So we really are a one-stop shop for institutions and for technology companies when they're dealing with any kind of legal issues. So that could be immigration, it can be HR, it can be grants issues before the federal government if you need to sue the federal government. It can be engaging with Congress. So it's really a one-stop shop for higher ed. And my day-to-day is meeting with elected officials, meeting with senior officials within the administration, and really trying to advance my clients' interests before the federal government. That usually comes in two buckets roughly. One is you have an institution that's in some sort of trouble and they want to get out of hot water. So say they get a big program review liability from the Department of Ed, we help them navigate that and get through the process. That is fun, but it's stressful. And sometimes it can be kind of a bet the institution situation because sometimes a very large liability, especially given an institution size, can be very disruptive. The one that I really like to do is creating new markets. So using legislation, using rulemakings, using appropriations to find new ways to find revenue for institutions, for programs, and for companies. That requires a lot more creative thinking, usually a long-term strategic plan where you're getting iterative small wins every year. But after maybe a 5-year strategic plan, you have an entire grant program that's designed around your interests and what you're really trying to do. So it's a little bit of a sword and shield, if you want to call it that. But I really, really thrive on the creating new market side.
We love that. Thanks for giving that little bit of insight, because if people don't know you, they don't know what you do in DC. So I'm going to start it off by asking you sort of to talk about the elephant in the room, sort of the obvious thing.
Which one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The one that is going to be a problem at midnight, the government shutdown and its impact on everyone, but especially higher ed. So, Chris, give us your insights and your thoughts on that.
So, we're all adults here. We've all lived through government shutdowns in our adult lives here. Just taking a step back, why are we even here? So the federal government operates on an annual calendar of October 1st to September 30th. And every year, Congress is supposed to pass 12 different appropriations bills that in sum fund the entire federal government by September 30th of each year. And if they don't do that, then there's either a full or partial shutdown of the federal government. Congress is very, very off-piste, so to speak, on appropriations. It has been for more than 20, 30 years. At this point, it's been about 30 years since we had a healthy appropriations process where everything happened on time. So where we are now is Congress never seems to finish their work by September 30th. They have to do these short-term continuing resolutions to keep funding moving forward. And then sometime in the coming months, they come to some sort of resolution about finalizing appropriations. What, by the way, is odd, and this is not really that germane for this conversation, but Congress is currently operating under, or at least through today, and the federal government is operating under Biden-era appropriations from 2024, because when Congress tried to do this last year, both at the end of the Biden administration and the beginning of the Trump administration, they couldn't come to an agreement on final appropriations. So we are now dealing with appropriations that are more than 2 years old and weren't even from this administration. It's just really, really incredible that we're kind of continuing on and unable to pass appropriations bills. And the reason why we're having a shutdown is none of those 12 bills are done, and both parties are blaming each other. Now, Republicans passed a continuing resolution out of the House, and they're trying to pass it in the Senate, but appropriations requires beating the filibuster, so you need 60 votes in the Senate. And that, as a result, has to be bipartisan. It has always been a bipartisan process in appropriations. Hopefully, it always stays bipartisan. It's kind of the one last bastion of bipartisanship in Congress, where you're not going to get a super partisan bill either right now. If Republicans are in charge, they tend to get more Republican-friendly policies, and the inverse for Democrats. But still, you need to come to the table and come to some sort of agreement with the other party. Where we are now is Republicans passed a continuing resolution without any input from Democrats. And Democrats are now saying, well, if you want our votes, you're going to have to put something that we need in the bill. and the Republicans are saying go pound sand. Just to be clear, like no party is pure on this, but the Republicans do the same thing to Democrats as Democrats do to Republicans when they're in the majority. And in the past, these things have always been bipartisan. And when there are resolutions, these things happen on a bipartisan basis. So, the White House and congressional leaders are going to spend a lot of time blaming Republicans for this shutdown, but in fact, that's not the most fair thing because it certainly would be the inverse if the Democrats were in charge.
And Chris, what for higher education operations starting tomorrow, what's the effect going to be?
Okay, so a couple things. So most importantly, I don't think there's going to be a disruption in direct loans or in Pell Grants. So that the traditional core Title IV aid should continue to flow. The main major question that I have is whether we have, if we were to have an extended shutdown, let's say it extends more than a month, do we start running into operational problems where FSA is running out of funding to keep the lights on and have trouble paying their vendors to keep computer systems going? We haven't been there before. The longest shutdown in history was in 2018 rather, and that was 35 days, I believe, or just around there. But during that one, the Department of Ed was open because that bill had been completed in time. So we really haven't been in an environment where there's been a very protracted, and by very protracted, I mean more than about 2 or 3 weeks of a shutdown. And I just don't think we know what that looks like. But as of tomorrow, institutions should still be able to draw down Title IV aid. Now, for other programs, if you were trying to draw down funds for, say, grants, a lot of that is going to go still for a while the Department of Ed furloughs most of its employees. About 95% of its employees will be furloughed. And essentially, they all go pencils down on their work. They go home, and bizarrely, they're not even allowed to touch or work on their work computers while a shutdown happens. And the last communication that they get from their bosses says, you are to watch the news to find out when the shutdown is over and when it is permissible for you to come back into the office. So this isn't something where, like, the civil servants are dancing in the streets and having days off. They're not getting paid during this time. So if they've got a mortgage payment or something else, they're going to have to find other sources for that. And it's very disruptive to their everyday work because they've got to plan kind of a couple of days before the shutdown to shut things down. And they've got to then be out of the office just doing nothing for weeks. And then when they come back, they've got to figure out how to take off all the pieces. So the last thing that I would mention, I think this is less direct impact to institutions, but it's very much worth considering. The Department of Education right now is just beginning the regulatory process for the implementation of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. I expect we'll get more into this later. I'm going to call that OB3. So that was the reconciliation bill that was the Trump administration and congressional Republicans' big legislative priority for this Congress that they passed and enacted last July, so just a couple of months ago. There are several rulemakings that are in process. One of those started yesterday. So they are now 2 days into, or by the end of today, will be 2 days into that rulemaking, which relates to student loans and the changes that were made to student loans in OB3. Now, there's some different word happening out of the department today, so I don't really know what to make of that. But the plan as of yesterday was to stop the rulemaking tonight, send everybody home, and then reconvene the rulemaking after the shutdown is over in a virtual context. We heard today from one of my colleagues on the ground that the department is now saying that they're going to try to continue the rulemaking tomorrow, but are going to take it on a day-by-day basis. I don't know whether that's true because ostensibly you wouldn't have security guards able to let people into the building. I don't know how operationally they're going to be able to do that. The janitorial staff won't be able to clean bathrooms. There are a lot of other ways that we all know that you need to run an office building, especially a secure federal office building. So I'm not really sure whether it's going to continue or not, but no matter what happens, I think this administration is still going to have an aggressive regulatory agenda, and they're trying to get all of that finished. But it's just worth noting that rulemaking is happening right this minute.
Crazy. Other sort of longer term impacts if the shutdown does go long, what do we need to be cautious about?
The biggest thing that I have my eye on, and a lot of you might have seen this in the news, is that the director of the OMB, Russ Vought, who was one of the authors of Project 2025, and has really been a leading force inside the Trump administration when it comes to budget and a lot of other federal policy, particularly in the way that they use funds that have been appropriated by Congress. He sent out a memo late last week, essentially saying that that the Trump administration would not only be relying on furloughs for this shutdown, but they'd also be conducting additional reductions in force. So it is possible now, just taking a step back, the Department of Ed has already cut its personnel by about 50%. It's possible that both OMB and the White House use the shutdown to not furlough a certain section of federal employees, but to permanently lay them off. And so they could potentially conduct a reduction in force. Now, what does this all mean? Well, I think we're still grappling now with what it means to have a much leaner Department of Ed and federal workforce, because there were already capacity issues for the agency and for all agencies going into the Trump administration. And now you have this massive departure of people. Are they able to do the day-to-day things? Can they get changes of ownership improved? Can they get new programs out the door? Can they do all of their day-to-day work that they have to do? And if you cut it even further than the 50% that has already happened, it is just further reducing the resource capacity that on a human level of being able to get things done over at the Department of Ed. So that is really the long-term consideration that I'm thinking about, because if we're say they decide to get rid of another 10 or 25%, then we're getting into 50% is already an enormous cut. If it's even more than that, it makes me wonder how much the agency is actually going to be able to do on a day-to-day basis. Darcy, you're on mute.
You're on mute, Darcy.
Story of my life. James, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. I just wondered about visa processing, which is also already a mess for international students, how this will disrupt for those students.
That's a really great question, James. Immigration is one of the areas that's the most complicated, as you know, for institutions to navigate. The student visa system, which is called SEVIS at the Department of Education, is notoriously difficult to work with. Unlike FSA, they don't make it very available to give you a clear point of contact if you have an issue with SEVIS. I think the expectation there is that that the student visa processing, it might not go all the way down to zero, but that it's going to slow fairly dramatically. But the problem there, James, is, as everyone on here knows, there have been all of these radical changes, sometimes, day to day on how the visa system is working right now. We saw the changes about H-1B visas just more than a week ago. There have been kind of fits and starts on whether we're letting foreign students into the country. So, just layering on top of, essentially a government agency pulling the plug and stopping work, we already were going into this in a very, very difficult environment for students and for institutions to navigate, okay, can this student get to campus? And/or can we get this professor or administrator into the country to do their work? So unfortunately, I don't expect the shutdown to make the immigration quagmire that we're currently in any better.
The other question I have is around loan processing with the Department of Ed. I have several students who are in college with loans. Then I have several colleagues who were in the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program who have more than completed their 10 years. And they can't find anybody to talk to know how to get their loan forgiveness process. So both the folks with current loans as well as others, I mean, I'm just speaking anecdotally here, but I know 10 or
Yeah.
12 folks in those two categories, and nobody is getting any help anywhere.
Yeah, another great question, James. So I'm going to break those down because they seem like they're in the same bucket, but they're actually quite different. For folks that are currently, if you're an institution currently enrolling students, or you're a family that's interested in, say, a fall start or late fall start, say an October, November start, student loans, I hope, will continue to flow for individuals and families. That should be uninterrupted, with the caveat that I said we just don't know what happens if it's an extended shutdown. I will not get into too much specifics here because the PSLF side is an area where I know way too much, but I will tell you that the problem with PSLF is the Department of Ed. And I mean this on a deeply non-political basis. The Obama administration, the Trump administration, the Biden administration, and now the Trump administration have all really, really failed in their implementation and oversight and execution of the federal loan program on the repayment side. I know the current team is trying to fix that, and you do have some experts with lots of experience in the higher ed lending world over there now. But, for example, a lot of the blame, especially from Elizabeth Warren and others, has gone towards student loan servicers. And I would argue that that's deeply unfair because, for example, if a borrower calls into their loan servicer and says, I have made all of the qualifying payments and my loan should be forgiven, the student loan servicer can say, we agree with you, but we sent your file back to the Department of Ed and they need to tell us to write your loan down to zero. And we've been waiting for 8 months for them to get that data back to us. Now, the servicers aren't in a position to just say, your loan went from $200,000 to zero for good reason, because we don't want vendors of the federal government just making things up as they go along. But all of the data and all of the big decisions happens at the agency, and then they push it out to the vendors. And if the vendors don't have those data sets, they're unable to do it. So as I said, through all of these administrations, the hiccup has almost always been on the Department of Ed side. And that's what the problem is here, is that the Department of Ed is saying, call your student loan servicer. And the student loan servicer is saying, we've done everything that we humanly can. And there's no one to call after the Department of Ed to say, why haven't you sent my data back to the loan servicer to forgive my loan? So it's this very, very frustrating kind of doom loop that no one seems to be able to solve. Now, my hope is this administration is really trying to clean up and reduce these programs, that somehow they're going to be able to magically get this on better footing. But I've lived through too many administrations, and I think this loan program is fundamentally broken. And I think it needs fairly radical reform. And I am skeptical that any Department of Ed is going to be able to operate the loan program in a way that fully benefits the borrowers and the American people.
Thank you.
Thanks, James. Chris, that was a good conversation. The other day we were talking, and the whole do no harm, gainful employment. What's your take on that with regard to everything that's going on with the OB3 and everything?
Yeah, great question. Just as background, so a lot of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with gainful employment because we've been talking about it for 15 years. But it's the regulation that comes and goes and comes and goes and comes and goes. Where did we leave gainful employment, financial value transparency at the end of the Biden administration? For the first time, the administration under Biden expanded the system to include all programs. So all programs and all institutions were required to submit data to the Department of Ed. By the way, the deadline for the real first deadline for data submissions is today and tomorrow. So institutions, financial aid offices, and others are bizarrely going to be submitting a lot of their data, and including their most recent data, on a day that the federal government would be shut down. Go figure. But also, as a refresher there, only the gainful employment programs, so that the proprietary institutions and certificate programs of all institutions were liable or could potentially be subject to the punitive measures of gainful employment, which means your program could be shut down if you didn't meet their benchmarks. Now, that regulation has been generally disfavored by Republicans, and it's currently the subject of a lawsuit. And we entered the administration not really knowing what they would do. Like, hey, would they seek financial value transparency because this administration does like data, but maybe get rid of the gainful employment part? We don't really know. Well, then we got to OB3, and the House Republicans proposed a very aggressive accountability framework in the House passed version of the bill, which would have potentially required institutions each to pay millions of dollars a year back to the federal government as essentially recompense for a percentage of the defaults of their graduated students. So the higher ed lobby did not like this. A lot of folks didn't like this. And then when the bill turned to the Senate was like, turn to say, what are you going to do in terms of an accountability system? Nobody really knew. Well, the Senate came up with this proposal called Do No Harm. By the way, the Senate won and the House lost, so Do No Harm got put in the final bill. And Do No Harm, bizarrely, even though Republicans traditionally have not liked gainful employment, is a lot like gainful employment. So Do No Harm does have some major differences, though. First of all, it has a full statutory framework, unlike gainful employment. So it's on much more solid legal footing, should there be a lawsuit one day. But a couple of things to keep in mind with Do No Harm. It completely excludes certificate and non-degree programs. For me, that has always made sense. These are more affordable programs. How much ROI are you really going to get on, a very short-term course? And to measure your post-graduation earnings and trying to assess that always seemed like it was a bit of a difficult step. But what it is included for is for undergraduate programs and professional and graduate programs. Running roughshod over all of this, but generally the standards that for comparison are, they're going to compare graduates of bachelor degree programs with folks that only graduated from high school in their state. And they're going to compare graduates of graduate and professional programs compared to folks who graduated from a bachelor's degree program. So what they're trying to do is show that clear ROI, like, had you not done this program, did your earnings actually go up? Now, as you can imagine, there are a lot of things to consider here. That rulemaking doesn't start until December. And so the department has a lot of decisions to make between now and then. Are they going to just completely get rid of gainful employment, which makes sense to me? Because why would you have two regulatory systems that are essentially doing the same thing, but would be slightly different and would be very difficult for institutions potentially to comply with both? It seems like a clean moment to say we're going to get rid of gainful employment and we're going to put all of our eggs in the Do No Harm basket. We just don't know if that's what the agency is going to do. Maybe they keep financial value transparency and Do No Harm. Again, that seems problematic because you would have Do No Harm metrics and financial value transparency metrics. Doesn't seem that easy to do. So the cleanest thing to me would be for them to go completely in the direction of Do No Harm. And by the way, when a Democratic president gets back into the White House, they could still rewrite the regulations and make them more like gainful employment. But at least they would be on very solid statutory footing. So long and short of it is some sort of ROI income-based system is going to be part of higher ed accountability going forward.
Okay, great. I was looking at Rob. I didn't know if he was going to jump in or.
Yeah, I can't. I mean, let's go over to what else is keeping you up at night, Chris. I know you ran down several topics when we chatted the other day.
Well, and Mark Schneider put a question in. So after you talk about this, we'll go to Mark.
Yeah, Yeah, Mark makes a great point about Workforce Pell also has a new work outcomes framework. That's a great point. Mark, something that I'm just very interested in is how much does Workforce Pell actually take off? So these are programs that are shorter than traditional, the bottom of the eligibility for Pell. But there are a lot of belts and suspenders in terms of compliance and accountability that institutions have to comply with. And I have wondered from the beginning, when the first bills were being drafted around this, is all of this just going to be too complicated and working with governors and workforce systems? Is this just going to be too much to make this program actually take off? I think a lot of these accountability components of Workforce Pell were initially put in when Workforce Pell was designed to be somewhat agnostic between, not completely, but somewhat agnostic between university providers and then like coding boot camps. So organizations that were not in Title IV, but during the consideration of OB3, only institutions were ultimately allowed to participate, which kind of leads me to believe, like, if you're doing Workforce Pell, why not just shorten the bottom of Pell and just keep the other standards in there? So all of it doesn't really make sense to me, and it's going to be interesting to see, like, if this can actually take off. But to answer your question, Rob, what else keeps me up at night? One area where we're doing a lot of work that is just so incredibly complicated is the federal grant-making space. And as I mentioned, this administration has been fairly aggressive in using the federal grant systems to their political benefit. And that has made it very, very difficult for institutions, if you have any kind of grant program, to try to navigate what all of this means. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So say you had funding for a college access program, and during, say, the last Trump, and some of this is hypothetical and some of it is based on the true story, so like you can read between the lines here. But say you have a college access program at your institution, and the prior Trump administration told you to consider X in your application, and then the Biden administration said, hey, by the way, in addition to X, we want you to also include DEI in your application. And now the Trump administration comes back and says, well, if you have if you have X or Y in your application, we're not going to continue your grant and we're going to cancel it mid-cycle. Well, the institution says, we were just following what you told us to do at the time. This feels deeply unfair. And they're correct. So other institutions navigate all of this. They've got, potentially all of these holes in their budget. They're going to lay off people in these offices that are supported by federal grants. But what is so incredibly complicated is, are they in a position to sue? If an association sues, can it get the kind of relief that they need? The federal jurisprudence. So courts are coming up with decisions in this grant space almost every single day, including the Supreme Court. So there are massive changes that are happening on what court you could go to, even if you had the resources to and decided to sue. Are you going to district court? Are you going to the federal court of claims? Where on earth do you go to get this relief? And then at the end of the day, is that relief ever even going to be there for you? Because does the agency even have the money anymore? Because maybe they spent it on something else. So it's really a mess. The other thing that's so incredibly difficult for institutions to navigate is we are aware of several instances where, for example, you had a grant that was an access grant, and it gets discontinued for having diversity references in it. But they go back to the application and there are no diversity references. And they try to get the administration to choose to reverse course, and they can't get them to. So they lost their funding for having DEI in their application when they didn't have DEI in their application. But then another grant program that maybe the administration does like, they're going out to their grantees and saying, hey, by the way, if you put DEI in your prior application, if you want to revise that and see tell us how you're not using DEI now, that would be great. So we can just have that on the record. So like all of these things are happening, like not in vacuums. And even within the same grantee organization, one grant is being treated one way, another grant is being treated another way. It is just so complicated and convoluted to navigate. I mean, we all know that the federal grant making space is very complicated to begin with, that it is a very, very complicated shell game to follow. And these are real people with real jobs that have, in some cases, have been doing this work for many decades. And their life's work is being ended overnight, and their institution is not in a position to just write a check for $500,000 or $1 million or whatever it is to keep the grant program funded. So that's another area, Rob, where it is very, very complicated to navigate, and it just feels like quicksand underneath all of us because the facts and circumstances are changing every single day.
Well, speaking of grants, I mean, we've had grants cut off here in Illinois, University of Illinois and other universities. In one example, it was a grant that was an agriculture grant. It had the word diversity in it because it was talking about the diversity of the biome that they were studying. And they cut the grant because it had diversity in the grant. And it was a multi-million-dollar grant to do some very important work on the future of agriculture, not just for Illinois, but for the United States. But I mean, stuff like that, just, the attack on research grants is just, I mean, I get the ideological effort, but some of it's just crazy. I mean, I don't, this was speaking to the diversity of nature. They were trying.
You can't argue that.
Well, James, let's take it like one step further. So the term that the administration likes is viewpoint diversity when they're talking about making sure that people on the right are respected in academia. So ostensibly, if you were using their own term, viewpoint diversity, you could have your grant cut because it still has the word diversity in it. And James, I also completely agree with you. So I kind of see the research grant side as something completely different because research grants are a smaller number of institutions that are dramatically affected, but when they are, it is so enormous what the implications are for their bottom line. And just in my humble opinion, it makes no sense if you're on year 4 of a 5-year grant on agriculture. Why on earth just finish the grant and then change the parameters for the next application process? I think we all know the answer to this. This administration is in a rush to get as much of their worldview pushed through their federal system as they can, so they don't want to wait. But I mean, just finish the cycles of people that have multi-year grants. I mean, you're not going to have a 40-year grant. All of these grants are going to wind up expiring during the term of this administration. Redo it for the next cycle. And that's what really, really just rubs me the wrong way, because you have these researchers and really, really good people that are doing excellent work on the ground. And yes, it can be heartbreaking for them not to get their renewal grant and have to stop at that point, but don't make them stop in the middle of their work.
I don't mean to overdo. I go by Jim, by the way. I just haven't gotten around to changing my profile.
Jim, sorry about that.
But it's okay.
My dad's name.
It's got James up there. So I'm on the board of what I call a whole set of Midwest good but not rich and not well endowed private colleges. And one of the things they're grappling with now, which I have not seen a lot of discussion of outside of higher ed, is the cuts to Medicaid and SNAP and these other places, because they enroll a lot of low-income students, and they're desperately, without a lot of money and on their own campuses, trying to figure out, how do we feed these people? How do we give them health care? And this is a significant portion of their student population. So I think when people think of Medicaid cuts and they think of SNAP and food cuts, they don't think about higher ed. But even though we've talked about food insecurity on campus for a long time in higher ed, so I don't know if anybody's talking about that anywhere or not, but there are going to be a significant number. I mean, I would suspect millions of students are going to be impacted by those cuts, and whether they're going to be able to stay in college or not is really an open question.
I couldn't agree more. I co-sign that entirely. And the other problem there, Jim, is the way that OB3 was written is a lot of the The bad parts of OB3 will happen after the midterm elections.
Right.
So people might get to the ballot box in 2026 and say, well, I heard that all of these Medicaid cuts were coming, these SNAP cuts were coming, but the world hasn't collapsed. And then just wait for 27 or 28 where it could get really bad. And we all know, if you've got a destructive event in a family, that can set a student's academic career off the rails immediately, and it's very, very hard often to get back. And so, Jim, I didn't even think about it just in terms of the students and what their direct access to Medicaid or SNAP. I also think about, what if grandma is now going to be ill and she can't be in a nursing home because of Medicaid cuts?
Great point.
What if grandma, because of other cuts, passes away and then the student has to go home, but they don't have the resources to fly back? All of these systems that we've cobbled together for decades, however imperfect they are, kind of existed as an ecosystem to keep higher ed and the rest of the economy flowing. And I really just don't feel like we fully grasp how, if you kind of turn down one lever, what the rest of the economy looks like.
Thank you. That's a really good point. The impact on their family, because they will give up college for their family. That's
Absolutely.
something we know
They
about
will.
many of these
Yeah.
students that we're trying to keep
So-
in college. Yeah, sorry.
No, it's great. I love the conversation. I'm going to ask Chris to put on his prognosticator cap here in just a second, while the rest of you think about if there's any questions you want to ask in our Q&A session coming up. So, Chris, a whole lot's going on, coupled with longer term demography shifts. There's this constant drumbeat around questioning the value of college. Is it worth it? What's your prediction? I mean, like some of the stuff Jim mentioned, for a while I served as a trustee on a small private, and a change in a visa policy can blow a huge hole in a small tuition dependent institution's revenue. And so with this level of uncertainty, coupled with sort of some of the longer terms, what do you think is going to happen within the higher education sector?
Okay. I'm going to contradict myself a little bit here, Rob. But so for some reason, I got stuck on listening to a lot of podcasts and reading about, this is a very bizarre topic, but Argentina at the beginning of the 20th century.
Okay.
And so Argentina, circa 1900, 1920, there was a term in Europe, like if you went to the south of France, the term was you wanted to be rich like an Argentine, because they were by far and away the richest people in the world. And they had these huge migrations from the same countries, by the way, where we got immigrants from at that time, to Argentina, given their vast wealth. And Argentina has incredible natural resources. And they then kind of got to the pre-war era and really started to struggle because of poor economic policy that happened at the federal level. And then, we all know, the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical and like Madonna, Evita, we've heard about that. But, learning more about Juan Perón is really interesting because he's so much like Trump, because it's not really a left versus right politics. It is completely around the cult of personality. So some things are far left, some things are far right, but it really is all about, Perón. And Trump is very, very similar in that way as well. And my concern is, like, the more I learned about Argentina during that time, the more concerned I am about what track that we're on, because all of these policies, start to embed themselves in the economics and culture of a society, and very quickly over time become difficult to fix and go back. And as we've seen, Argentina never recovered from Peronism. They're still struggling with this. They want a bailout now, even though then the next day they turn around and buy Chinese soybeans and punch us in the face, even though we say we're going to give them a bailout. So,
Right.
like, I know we didn't come on here to discuss Argentina, but my feeling is we have this really great example of an incredibly wealthy resource country that made a series of bad decisions and then didn't seem to be capable of fixing their way, no matter how hard they tried for the subsequent decades or centuries at this point. So that's kind of the downside. The upside is higher ed is incredibly resilient in the US. It is an enormous industry. I wouldn't say that it's like a powerful industry. It's not the pharmaceutical industry. I think we as an industry have done a terrible job at selling our ROI and truly sharing the lasting contributions that a post-secondary education leaves on all of us as a society. And, I think difficult years are ahead. We were going into a demographic cliff to begin with. And then you add to that potentially fewer international students, and institutions may have a rough road ahead. But ultimately, I believe in American higher education. I think it is too strong to just be able to completely destroy. And I also say at the end of the day, a lot of the folks that have turned into the biggest opponents of American higher ed are also going to be borrowing, stealing for their kids to get into UT Austin or UCLA or Harvard. So at the end of the day, the same people that want to take down the system are the ones that are dying to use it. So I do have this, maybe unfounded or unrealistic optimism, but I do think higher ed is ultimately going to survive this chapter.
Great, thank you. And
There's
Mark,
Sorry for the Argentine divergence there.
yeah.
Mark, do you
Thanks,
want to
now I'll
come
have
on?
nightmares.
Mark, do you want to come on live and ask your question?
Sure. Thanks, Darcy. Yeah, the question is really just sort of looking holistically across various pending executive orders, the new reconciliation law. How will some of these policies drive, or will they, and to what extent drive expansion of competency-based education programs in higher ed? Thanks.
I'm going to go out on a limb here because I can't think of anything that is going to be directly negatively impacting competency-based education. My sense is that competency-based education is still going to be kind of on the same path that it was, and potentially changes to accreditation could make the environment somewhat more favorable, but that is kind of far off. And I think it's so opaque that we don't really know what direction all of that will go in. And what I said thus far is just from a regulatory perspective. My bigger concern on CBE is whether institutions are going to be in a position to be doing or thinking about executing innovative concepts that require investment. Because they have so many other concerns from their business officers, very justifiably, on what the financial picture looks like with them, for them.
Good point. That's exactly what I mean. I was thinking these schools are pulling their hair out right now to try to shift and do something more innovative. Even if it's a financial issue of not to do it, but it's the people, they're worn out. I mean, they're just like, and now you want us to redesign our programs to be CBE. I mean, they may want to, but only so much energy in a day. But
yes, yeah.
But one of my
folks are
concerns,
trying to survive, not thrive.
yeah. I mean, I'm optimistic as well, but I think the part of our mission that is most threatened right now is our ability to serve those who most need us, the folks in the lower middle and the lower classes economically. And when we look at the Georgetown University Center for the Workforce and look at their studies that show over 70% of what they call good jobs, $40-something thousand a year in benefits, et cetera, are going to require some form of post-secondary, and nearly half of those a 4-year degree. The people who really need that are, I mean, a lot of those folks who are, like you said, I don't know they're big borrowing, stealing, because the cost of higher ed for rich people is still really affordable. It's such a small part of their overall income. But my concern is the fate of all these students at the lower end of the economic continuum that were most need us And most need us now more than ever to help raise them up to be ready for a 21st century economy that's going to be impacted by all kinds of technology, not just AI, and other kinds of shifts. So that's my concern. I think higher ed, I agree with you. I think higher ed will survive this, but what forms of it will thrive and what parts of it will suffer over the next decade because of what's happening right now.
Jim, I agree with you with one caveat. I would extend that also into middle-class families. You know, Republicans, I think, for decades, really until very recently, I think undersold their contribution to trying to keep programs like Pell well-funded. I know we don't think it's well-funded, but they really have been advocates for Pell behind the scenes. And you know, the focus, the shift now is really away from supporting those low-income students. But I also think that the crunch is just going to get worse and worse for middle-income families. And for them, they are going to be cutting, you know, the parents are willing to cut off their arms and their legs to send their child to a school like Georgetown or UT Austin. And because they suspect that the ROI is worth it, and it usually winds up being exactly that. So I share your sentiments. I think for rich people, the system is always going to work for them, just as it did pre-1965, right? Because not many people went to college, but rich people did just fine and went to college then. And
rich white man.
Right. Rich white men went to college at that point. And then, you know, the slow but incremental progress we've been trying to make to get middle income and low income families in and through college over 60 years, however imperfect that's been, has certainly been an improvement. And it does feel like it has been a long arc forward, and we're now kind of changing course on the promise we've made to so many Americans.
Well, and Shannon, do you want to ask your question? Because I mean, we were talking earlier about the impact on the shutdown on loans and things, and now we're talking about middle class and lower economic status class. She has a question, I think, about going forward.
Yeah, just generally, how do you see that the administration's policies are going to impact student loans and federal financial aid? Is it still going to be as available as it's been, which is salient to what we were just talking about?
Yeah, great question, Shannon. So the good news there's good news and bad news. I promise I'm not going back to Argentina. There's good news and bad news. The good news is undergraduate lending is almost exactly the same as it always has been. So financial aid should not change post OB3. Obviously, there are going to be changes to repayment systems that will be less generous, but in general, if you're borrowing for an undergraduate degree, there were no changes in OB3. The big changes happen for graduate and professional borrowing. So if you are going to, say, a private medical school and taking out full loans, your federal grant loans will now probably cover about 40 to 50% of the cost of that degree. So you're going to have to go and get potentially more expensive, higher interest rate loans to support your graduate and professional education. Now, I will tell you, when I went to law school 20 years ago, that's exactly the system that it was. You could take out a portion of federal loans, and the balance you had to get from private loans, and it was about 50-50. That changed, and now we're kind of going back to that system. My big concern there is that at the time, we had a very healthy, again, imperfect, but we had a very healthy lending environment for student loans, both on the public and the private side. Over the last 15 years, private loans have largely died on the vine. There just aren't very many private loans. And now every single institution in the country who wants to continue borrowing or having their students borrow for graduate and professional education after just next July 1st, 2026. So we're just months away from that. Is scrambling to get borrowing arrangements in place with private lenders to support their students. And the problem is, and I certainly would not have included that date in the legislation, because the problem is, even for a large organization, it's not like they just, put this money on a credit card. they have to do many complicated things, including going out to the private markets and borrowing money before they then lend it out to other individuals. So this is not an on-off switch. The capacity that we had around the private student loan ecosystem really got starved for the last 15 years, and now we're just kind of expecting to set it up within a couple months. And what I fear, and I hope doesn't happen, but what I fear is going to wind up happening is come July 1st, 2026. By the way, if you're currently enrolled in medical school, there are exemptions, like you can continue to borrow the maximum amount if you were, say, in your third year of medical school going into your fourth. But if you were starting your first year of medical school after July 1st of next year, that's where the new system is fully in effect. And my concern there is, with the system really currently not capable of giving out the volume of loans that it did 15, 20 years ago, who's going to be able to borrow and who's not going to be able to borrow? And the individuals that feel like they're going to be able to borrow are probably going to be from higher income backgrounds whose parents set them up with good credit scores, and individuals who maybe have no credit history or whose family weren't as well off are not going to be able to access loans because there just are the system doesn't yet exist to be able to set all of that up. So I hope this doesn't happen, and I hope that borrowers are going to be able to continue their education and that people's educations aren't disrupted, especially for things like MD programs, because we need more vets, we need more nurses, we need more doctors, so especially in healthcare professions, but in every profession. I really do hope that folks are able to get the loans that they need to support their education and finish their programs and get into the workforce.
Wow. It's almost been an hour. Goes by so fast.
It does, it's fun.
I'm always smarter at the end of these things. Thanks, Chris.
I am. Every time I hear Chris talk about things, I'm like, I don't know if I cry or smile or just feel a little more educated about what's happening. We thank you so much, Chris, for joining us today. And many thanks to Jim and Shannon and Mark for joining in. I hope it was a good conversation for everyone else. This has been recorded, and give me a day or so and I will have the recording to each of you that you can review or share with others. Because I think anytime Chris talks, people listen and they get good information. So thank you so much, Chris. Thank you all for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Gotta go
Great to see you
Stockholm,
all.
I think. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye, Jim.
Bye.